With the recent events in the Russian-Ukrainian war and the resulting sanctions that the U.S. government has imposed, the number one thing that financial institutions need to remain aware of is that really it's a moving target. So anything that is in effect as of today is likely to be changed and perhaps strengthened within the coming weeks and months. So really it's not just about knowing what the precise requirements are as of right now, but also knowing how to stay current with what those requirements are, because they're going to be changing. And if you look at some of the sanctions programs that are governing what's been added on, they have been in place for a number of years, since 2014 when the Crimean sanctions went into place in response to Russia's annexation at that time. And some of the new additions to the lists that are out there are under those same programs. And those ones in some ways are easier to comply with because they consist of lists that each bank will run through their various OFAC systems and screen accordingly. So those ones I think are a bit easier to really grapple with, because the U.S. government, Treasury, and OFAC are putting a list together, and the lists are brought all into one aggregated source that the Treasury calls consolidated list, as opposed to the other list which they have as the SDN list. And when you look at that aspect, it's a bit easier to deal with. But when you review some of the sanctions here, the most complicated new set of executive orders and directives that are out there that institutions need to worry about is really Executive Order 14065. And that's known as the blocking property of certain persons and prohibiting certain transactions with respect to continued Russian efforts to undermine the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. The reason why it's difficult is that it's not strictly an executive order that is going to add in a sanctions program that consists of a list of names that you need to scrub your systems to find and make sure that you don't have. And that's one where there's a broad array of transaction purposes and geographies that don't constitute an entire country that they have prohibitions against. And what I mean by that is, if you dig into the details of that, the eastern sections of Ukraine that Russia is now centering their efforts upon, the Donetsk region, there's also the Luhansk region as well, identified in that executive order. Transactions there are, aside from all the various exclusions to the executive order, are just generally prohibited. And the difficulty is that there's that blanket prohibition, but at the same time, there's a lot of carve-outs for humanitarian purposes. For instance, person-to-person transactions are permitted as a exception to that rule. And there's a variety of those issued under the general licenses that OFAC has given. So understanding what those general licenses allow and what they permit is going to be a big part of understanding what is and is not allowed in terms of wire transactions and new accounts. Certainly you'll have to pay attention to the humanitarian aspect of this. I think financial institutions will have to look at the executive order there and pay attention to updates that may come out of the Department of Homeland Security with respect to perhaps new identification forms for those refugees, and make sure that they're up to speed with what those might look like and what kind of encoding they're going to have. That'll be a key part of customer due diligence. You really need to focus on three things: the list-based sanctions, the purpose-based sanctions, which are that executive order where Eastern Ukraine has a pretty blanket prohibition against transactions, but at the same time has a pretty large carve-out. And then lastly, there's the sanctions evasion component that institutions need to worry about. FinCEN has issued an advisory upon and an alert as well, to make sure that your lists are getting updated when OFAC updates their list, which is a control that's actually pretty common already for a lot of financial institutions. They just make sure that independent of whatever data loading that they've had into the system, they'll have another function that goes out and looks for the last day of an update and make sure that they comport. And it maintains a log of those. For instance, you want to show an auditor or an examiner that between this date and this date, all these updates happen. You can confirm that. That's one way to make sure that you're complying, and you can prove that you're complying as well. When you're looking at the more comprehensive sanctions that were issued through the executive order, which covers Eastern Ukraine, really is putting Ukraine on a heightened risk level within your AML systems. It depends on the system exactly how you go about doing that. Some systems may permit you to just add that, and you have all Ukrainian transactions basically showing up at your doorstep. While if you're a larger institution, that might be one where you would get flooded with false positive alerts to have to work through. So you might, for instance, drill down to a list of not only just the country name, but having a combination of the country name and cities within the region that are impacted by the executive order. So that way, for instance, if you look at Kyiv, that's not in the region that covers the executive order. A lot of financial transactions are going to flow through Kyiv that would not necessarily be something you would have to review to comply with that executive order. It really depends on your size and your risk tolerance as an institution. If you're playing it more conservative and you have the bandwidth to review those, you may just highlight all Ukrainian transactions and make sure that they're in accordance with what's permitted. On the outgoing side, if you have a customer that wants to send funds to Ukraine, the key there is that you're understanding at the front line what the purpose of the transaction is. Directly ask the customer, why the funds are going there, and have a cheat sheet ready to go for your tellers or other folks that are taking in those transactions, those wire transfers that they're going to have, and making sure that they're acceptable within the executive orders. And of course, as well, have them look into exactly where in Ukraine that is, making sure that it's not within a region that's covered by those sanctions. And then for the third aspect, when you're looking for sanctions evasion, really at that point, you're going to want to highlight Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and also a variety of common Russian offshore financial centers to flag those transactions for review. It's not going to necessarily be at a lower dollar amount as it would be for sanctions compliance settings that you would have in place for, say, Eastern Ukraine, but still at a reasonably lower dollar amount than what you would look at for just foreign wires in general or domestic wires. And those offshore centers that you may want to focus on would include, if you look at the United Arab Emirates, they were recently added to the Financial Action Task Force's gray list, which didn't directly attribute that to what was going on with Russia and Ukraine. However, if you read some of the press statements that were out there from the UAE leaders at the time, and just historically knowing where Russian oligarchs have laundered funds through, that's been a pretty common location for them to use. Another one would be Cyprus. Has been a pretty common offshore haven, but it's not going to be strictly limited to those. If you look at FinCEN's more recent guidance, then you're also going to have to be concerned about how oligarchs are perhaps moving money out of the United States or basically throughout the West, perhaps funneling it back into Russia, or at least to a jurisdiction that is on a better relationship with Western countries than where it's currently residing. That's not going to expressly be something that would be with a direct nexus to any location. That's one. If you read the advisory, just look for changes in beneficial ownership that are unusual, property sales that are either well below or well above market value, transactions that go to or from various offshore financial centers. You'll also have to keep an eye out if you have non-resident alien customers that are from, say, Russia or Belarus or other places where they've sort of been more tied to that influence, then you'll also want to perhaps raise their risk levels within the system so that you scrutinize their activity a little bit more. It's really hard to predict. It's very much development-based, as we can see from the outset of the war here, and that as the Russian efforts have stepped up, so have the sanctions. And I think that's a pattern that we're going to see continue. OFAC absolutely can and will penalize folks that do not comply. The severity of any potential fines or penalties that they levy upon anyone are going to be really a matter of circumstance. They would conduct an investigation first to determine why it exactly occurred. Let's say, for example, a matter of negligence versus an actual willful violation of the sanctions. Then a negligent institution may have a lesser fine, whereas one that is willfully violating the sanctions would have a much larger fine. But either way, given the gravity of the circumstances, that's certainly not a reason to be lax in the approach to ensuring that you comply with the requirements that are out there. We'll have to wait and see whether that's an approach the government takes with that, if they use a carrot along with the stick. But to this point, we haven't really seen any indication that there's going to be any quick removal of these sanctions. And I think it's more likely that we do see any sort of positive developments, that it would still be slow for those sanctions to be removed. In terms of resources, if you're not already, you should be subscribed to the Treasury's email subscription service, where you will receive updates pertaining to their new sanctions, their additions and removals from their various lists that are in place, which you can use to confirm that your system is getting updated on time and you're getting the new data that you need to. And additionally, you should familiarize yourself with OFAC's website and where they will house their guidance and information on how to comply with some of the more complex sanctions. They have certainly frequently asked questions that they've been updating quite often throughout this process that will help shed some light on what the new executive orders and directives really mean and how they really will impact banks and financial institutions throughout. Those are definitely some resources you want to keep an eye on and use to your advantage to keep up to speed with what's going on.